Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests and colleagues, may I have your attention, please? I would like to warmly welcome all of you who came to hear the lunch talk on American women bankers of Professor Eugene N. White, our current visiting professor for financial history. Before we begin what I'm sure will be an exciting talk, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor White to you. Eugene White, distinguished professor of economics at Rutgers University since 2005, took undergraduate degrees in history and economics from Harvard University and Oxford University. In 1890, I think
quite that
that's
old,
the right
almost.
date. He obtained a PhD in economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana. And since then, he had held a lot of academic positions in different European and American universities, for instance, in Europe, in Paris and Rotterdam, and at the Stern School of Business in New York, among others, and has also been a visiting scholar and fellow at several central banks in Europe and the US. He has been a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research since 1990 and has received numerous grants and awards. During his current stay in Frankfurt at Goethe University as our visiting professor of financial history, Eugene White is teaching, among quite a lot of other activities, like, for instance, yesterday's international conference on the evolution of central banking, a course for students on American financial crises. And in this context, he has kindly accepted the joint invitation of the House of Finance, the Leibniz Institute SAFE, the Institute for Banking and Financial History, IBF, and the Women in Economic History to give us a talk on his recent research concerning women bankers in 19th century America. As a member of the Women in Economic History, a working group that aims to present the research of activities of female economic and social historians of all areas, from ancient to modern times, and to promote especially the careers of young scholars, young female scholars, I should say, I'm very pleased to serve as a moderator for this talk today. So please, Eugene, the stage is yours, both here in the room and on the screens as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I just want to start off with this wonderful quote I found working here from Mary Church Terrell, who was a great civil rights activist in the 1930s, at really the height of many of the Jim Crow laws in the South. But she said, women bank presidents in the United States are very rare indeed. It is quite possible to go through it a whole lifetime without seeing one. And that sort of, I think, captures part of the problem here. And I think this is one about when we struggle a great deal to what's politically correct language? What's politically correct language for banking? Well, years ago, actually decades ago, when I was writing my dissertation, I read a wonderful book by John James called Money and Capital Markets in Postbellum America, 1876. And it looks at the second half of the 19th century. Now, John was a very liberal man and ahead of his time, very politically correct, and he used the degendered language to refer to his 19th century bankers as he and she. Now, when I read this, I was kind of puzzled because in the whole book, there wasn't a mention of a single woman. So was John was he writing a wrong where women had been ignored? Or was he basically sort of inadvertently covering up pervasive misogyny in the financial world? Because when you say this and there's no women, you may give the lie that there might have been. So have they been overlooked? Is the number of women in banks 1, 2, 0? We don't know. So I did the logical thing is I got a manila folder. I scribbled on it, women in banking, and I put it in my file cabinet. I trust that even the younger people know what a file cabinet looks like these days. And I put it there, and it just stayed there for the longest time. It just stayed very thin, and I found very few women. And this was very frustrating for a long time. And, I say for 3+ decades, there might have been a couple sheets of paper with notes, and that was it. So where were the women bankers? What about management? Well, one of the sources of documents for American banking, which is very important, are the reports of the Comptroller of the Currency. He was the federal regulator of national banks, and every year produced a heavy volume, sometimes somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pages long, on banks. And those reports have the name of the president, the CEO effectively, and the cashier, who today we call the chief financial officer. We have a lot of inflation in titles on these cases. But I'd never seen, in going through all these books, the name of a woman president or CFO or cashier. That there are also reports on the state banks with all, but every state produced record. So there are probably several thousand volumes of this. I also worked in the archives, and particularly national banks had examiners who went out twice a year to examine banks to make sure they weren't hiding things in their published reports. And I've been working on very much in the New York banks for their 40 to 50 banks, and over the period from 1888 just up to before the First World War. And I've never seen, and these I've looked very carefully, never seen a woman in senior management or on the board of directors. There's just no women. So that's a bit dismaying. And what about employees or boards of directors, shareholders, or depositors? The one source we do have some information where we do find women is in the records of savings banks. And particularly, as I'll show you, the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank, where showed there are a large number of women depositors. But as commercial banks, we don't know. I'll talk about that. So then I've done some internet searches, and I found a couple of women bank presidents, but I'll show you the very few. So after about 30+ years, I made a wonderful discovery in one of the annual reports of the Comptroller of the Currency. This was about a 500-page report. And I found that a report where they showed the number of women shareholders and the number of women employees and their payment. So that allows us some sort of view of who owned the banks. And I said, well, these must be like Hidden Figures. Now, if you haven't seen the movie Hidden Figures, it's quite a good, sort of good feel-good movie, but it's about, in the early years of the space race, calculations still had to be done on hand-run calculators. And they had a segregated workforce of women off in another building who did all the calculations. It had to be run through instead of a pre-computer. It turns out some of them were quite brilliant mathematicians. And at one point, when they were trying to get John and Glenn back to Earth, they had to figure out how to use a parabola to come into orbit and so forth. And one of them solves the problem. These are pictures of the actual women who eventually were vindicated and became very senior members of these NASA and so forth. But maybe there's some hidden figures in banking. So, but first, before doing this, we have to consider the legal and social regime. So, all these, it turns out you had to have some skin in the game if you were a banker or a president or a board of directors. You had to own some shares. So there should be some evidence, perhaps, of women owning shares. Now, what's the legal status? Common law determined the rights of women, defining them in two ways. You were either a femme sole or a femme couverte. Adult women were defined as single femme sole. They had considerable freedom to engage in business and make decisions and control their own property. They had pretty much free reign for the most part, except if social mores. A femme couverte, or a married woman, did not have a separate legal existence from her husband and was dependent like an underage child. She could not own her property in her own name or control her earnings. She could not sue or sign contracts in her own name. And even if her husband died, she could not necessarily be the guardian of her children. She had a dower right to the property she brought into the marriage. As well, if she sued, she could get 1/3 of her husband's estate for her life. So, but a married woman could, with her husband's permission, engage in business, but that can be withdrawn at any time. So, very big difference between the two. However, in the early 19th century, things began to change. They began to erode these features of femme couverte. And part of this takes place during the Jacksonian era, which is basically about the expansion of rights. Expansion of the rights to vote, incorporate business, obtain land, and open a bank. And you can see women getting some of these benefits. And it occurs at a time of financial crisis. And I can imagine that sometimes men wanted their women's estates separate, so if they went bankrupt, they'd still have some income from them. So beginning in the 1840s, states began to create separate estates for women. And the first important one is the New York Married Women's Property Act of 1848. And this allowed women to retain the profits and rents from real and personal property brought into a marriage and to receive gifts and bequests as if they were single. Now, that doesn't say necessarily anything about earnings. Earnings still belong to the husband, but that begins to change in 1855, and these are slow evolution, so giving women property rights. They actually take a long time because in many states it was not until the 1960s that women could own a bank account in their own name. And actually the Equal Opportunity Credit Act in 1974, women in some states needed a man to co-sign credit applications for them, and the law prohibited credit card companies and banks from discriminating. So that was good. And there's even in the 1980s a few cases to complete this. So this is just an example of the questions which would come up in this case. This is in 1888. This is a Supreme Court decision rendered in respect to the liability of a married woman holding stock in an insolvent national bank to an assessment of such stock. So a bank failed, and there was something called double liability, whereby every shareholder had to be able to pay up the amount invested originally in the bank. It was $100. It was a $100 par value share. They could be assessed up to that to cover the losses of depositors. And so this is a case where the receiver has levied a 50% assessment against the par value of the stock. The wife is dead, the husband inherited, but he cannot, it's still her estate. This is actually positive. It's still her estate, so it's assessed against her estate, but he cannot protect it by claiming it's his. Now, what about, so a lot of women are excluded a lot. What about I'd say the commonplace and the exceptions? There are quite a few exceptions. And these two women are this. This is the New York Sun commenting upon their activities on Wall Street. They say there are petticoats among the bovine, and ursine animals, in other words, the bulls and bears. And what the problem is, in addition to the legal regime, there's a long, strong feeling that decent women should not be out of the home. And yet there are women who tried to get credit. And these two are Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin. They opened a brokerage in 1870, Woodhull, Claflin and Company, and they did extraordinarily well. They had the backing of the wealthy Cornelius Vanderbilt, who admired Woodhull as a medium and was frequently visiting her. So we don't quite know this, but they had lots of customers, but they're an exception in terms of this. What about bank presidents and bank officers? The first bank president we can find perhaps is Louise Weiser, who became president of a county bank in Iowa in 1875. Her husband had died and she took over, but then as soon as her son came of age, she resigned. So she's basically just a place saver. Another first commercial bank president in Texas is 1901. And then I think perhaps even a real original, Maggie Lena Walker, is the first woman and first Black African-American in the US known to charter a bank and became president. She's head of the St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank in 1903. And we may have been encouraged by the fact that there were segregated institutions, and although segregation had many costs for African-Americans, it also, in states like Virginia, encouraged the development of separate institutions. And this is perhaps the best of all the African-American savings banks, and that's a photograph of her there. Now, I said I've looked at the annual reports of the Comptroller of the Currency. How could I overlook a female national bank president? Here's Louisa B. Stevens, made director of the First National Bank of Marion, Illinois in 1877. That's really way out on the frontier at that time. And she succeeded her husband in the bank in 1883. And the Wells Fargo history says that she was the second woman to head a bank in the US. And this is a banknote issued by the bank. Her picture. Well, how can I possibly have missed her? Well, here's the balance sheet statement from the Comptroller of the Currency. This is on page 1022. And there she is, L.B. Stevens. So with initials, you're not going to be able to find people very easily. And I don't know, cashier, male or female, and sometimes men use their initials as well. So it's very difficult to see women in this case. Now, another exceptional person, perhaps my favorite, is Hetty Green. She came from a Quaker family. If you don't know what Quakers were a religious sect, very modest and emphasizing hard work. They treated everyone with great equality. They started out in England and they would not take their hat off to the king as this, and they were very They're very hardworking, and her family made their fortune investing in whaling voyages. Now, whaling is one of the most risky activities possible because you can come back with nothing, or your ship could be actually taken under by a great white whale. And she was the only child, and she was trained by her father to be his bookkeeper at age 13. And she had a very modest inheritance, and she had long battles to get the rest of her inheritance in court. She got married, but she was very keen on making sure that her husband could not touch her money. And when he failed, she bailed him out, kept him under control. She moved to New York and became a very aggressive investor in railroads. And the railroad barons did not like her because she was always looking for the opportunity to take control. She had a desk in Chemical Bank and later moved to one of the fancier ones and worked every day. In the panic of 1907, she wrote a check to New York City to help repay off the short-term bonds that were maturing of $1.1 million, which is a huge sum in those days. And when she died in 1916, she had an estate of $200 million. J.P. Morgan had only about 80 million. Andrew Carnegie, about 350, and Rockefeller, 900. So she was among the 10 wealthiest people in the United States. She never sat on a board of directors, but then neither did the Rothschilds. It's all sort of behind. Now, she had a very bad press. And I guess you'd say, one, she was deplorable, yet Warren Buffett, the sage of Omaha, was celebrated. She was referred to as the Witch of Wall Street, maybe because of her magical abilities, but also because of her character. She followed the same routine every day. She was considered to be a miser, spending very little. In terms of Warren Buffett, he has the same routine every day. He's very frugal. She rented cold water apartments. In case you didn't know that in this period, there weren't many hot water apartments to begin with. And he has the same car in the same house he's had for the past, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. You wouldn't be able to tell it any different. He's not very fashionable. She wore the same dress every day until it was replaced. And one of the biggest charges against her was she avoided doctors when her son was injured and eventually had his leg amputated. I put a footnote down there because at the same time, President McKinley is shot and he dies. Why? His doctors don't wash their hands because they don't know they germ theory. That's some European idea, and stick their dirty fingers into his guts and he gets an infection. So avoiding a hospital is not a bad idea necessarily. And she's an aggressive value investor, much like him. Both offer assistance to New York City in the crisis. So it's very, very interesting how they're viewed. A contemporary cartoon, when the wealthy are made to pay a little income tax, you can see three people: Russell Sage, who's an important foundation for education, which endures today, and George Gould, who sat on many boards of national banks there, and they're all weeping on the way as they have to make a payment to Uncle Sam at the window. So she's an exception, very rare exception, but she's an independent investor. What about others? Well, the first woman national bank examiner is in 1921. Adelia Stewart, and she becomes, by 1922, she's the division chief of examinations. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is established in 1864. It's the oldest federal agency regulating banks. The Federal Reserve comes in 1914. They take a little bit longer. The first woman bank examiner for them is in 1967. But among the exceptional firsts, my favorite has to be Muriel Siebert, the first woman to have a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And they did not want her on it. They had every sort of arguments. She had enough cash to buy a seat, which was very expensive to do. They said, no, you have to get a loan. Then they worked it so she couldn't get a loan. Eventually she got a loan, got in, and small problems. You can be harassed in many ways. And one of the things was a lot of businesses used to be done in the lunchroom, this very elegant lunchroom, which I once had an opportunity to go at the New York Stock Exchange. There was a men's room, but the ladies' room was outside the building and across the way. And finally, Jesus said, you know what? You have to have this equal. If you don't establish a women's ladies' room, I'm going to have a porta potty put out in front of it. She had other more colorful things to say, but she eventually became the New York banking superintendent later on. Now, those are exceptions. What about the women depositors? We have good records from the savings banks in the 19th century. And I've worked with my colleague, Cormac O'Grada, on the Emigrant Industrial Savings Banks. This was founded in 1850 and it was objective is to promote thrift among the Irish immigrants. They're thought to be kind of, not necessarily reliable, to encourage them to save. There's an outgrowth of the Irish immigrant society, which was found to send remittances back to Ireland in the terms of the famine in the 1840s. But it was the 8th mutual savings bank in New York. Its clientele was mostly Irish, although there's a good mix of different types. And the savings banks are not as big as the commercial banks. In 1856, there were about 56 commercial banks having 66 million, only 16 savings banks with 22 million, but they had accounts of 132,000 depositors at the time. So they're very representative of the general population. Now, one of the things which is useful about the records there is this is a time when there's no established forms of identification. There's no driver's license. There's no social security number. There's nothing. So what they had to do when a person came in and said, I wanted to withdraw, they had a test book, which they had all about 30, 40 questions, which they'd ask when someone opened an account, including what was the name of the ship that you took from Ireland? What county did you come from? All these details, and including age, marital status, children, all the rest. And so that provides a great deal of information. We used this to see who was going to run in panics, whether it was the informed or poor people or the more well-informed, wealthier ones in terms of panics in the 1850s. But they've, with Mr. Enbinder, they've created a database of the first 18,000 accounts. It's a 20% sample. So it's of all those which opened between 1850 and 58. And this is a later building of the Immigrant Savings Society, quite an elegant structure. It's really a temple to savings. So I've gone through, this is just recently, to do a first pass about looking at women in the Immigrant Savings Society, see who was savings. And as you can see, there are more men than women, and there's deposits, initial deposits were slightly larger, but they're not that different. And then I decided, well, what's the distribution? You can see the number of accounts when men are slightly larger deposits at this time, but women, if you can look across at the largest deposits, you have 3.8% of the men having the largest deposits and 3% of the women. It's not that much different. But perhaps of more interest is about who had a joint account and who had an independent account. So there are 4,400 women with no joint account. Many of them are single, a widow, they just won't even declare what their status is. And then there's some married. So those ones might be ones where there was a claim on them. Then those with a joint account, a large number are married and a few are single. Those who are single or widow, it's usually with their aunt or with a child or so forth, is their joint account. So you can see a little bit of the hand of the law there. Who are they? Well, this is not completely well ordered, but you can see that they're mostly a lot of blue-collar workers, housekeepers, servants, washers, the needle trades. This is the sweatshops, very few skilled. There's a few business owners and so forth. Now, one thing about the Immigrant Savings Bank I should mention is they really wanted it to benefit poor people, and they didn't want it being taken over by businessmen. So the rules were that you could have an account up to $500 and you would earn 6% on that. Anything above that, they cut the interest rate. So you had people, well, what people did, of course, they tried to go around all the savings banks and split it. But it did tend to ensure that if you wanted to try and use it as a business account, it'd be very difficult. So we know that women deposited money, but did they get loans? That's a much harder thing to do because we don't have a great deal of idea about that. So what I found, the lucky thing which really propelled me was finding these tables about women shareholders and employees. And they're for all states and major cities. And actually, I think I'll show them first rather than part of it. So bank stock here is very important because after government and state bonds, it's considered one of the safest investments in this period, much safer than railroads. It's one of the first stocks. So, and it turns out it's fairly well diffused among the well-to-do. Now, the way they value the shares here are not their market value, but their par value of $100. Now, it turns out that most bank stocks didn't move much above that. They might go a little bit. So this is not a bad first pass. And in looking at this, what you see is that many investments were like for 10 and 20 shares for $1,000 or $2,000, which was a modest sum. So what do we see here? This looks at the number of women shareholders. You can see it's quite substantial. They have over 1 million shares, which would be valued at $148 million. The average number of shares is 13, so it's between 10 and 20. And the par value, as I said, is between that. What I did here is just selected from this. You can see the largest cities. What's interesting here is San Francisco. It's way on the frontier in 1897, and 45 women own a very substantial amount of the shares there. Let me actually go to the next slide. This is the percentage of women shareholders, men, and then corporations. These might be charities. So the US in total, women held 36% of all bank shares. That's an impressive number. However, their holdings tended to be smaller than men. They held about 22%. So men held the predominant amount. In New York City, it's pretty much the same as the US average. Philadelphia, men held a slightly higher. Boston, interestingly, a lot was held by corporations and by charities. And in San Francisco, a little bit more equal. I picked a group of states to represent different parts of the country, Maine being in New England, Delaware in the mid-Atlantic, Mississippi in the South, Indiana in the Midwest, Colorado, the Mountain West, and then Arizona, the far West. And you can see that women would still, even if they owned, as in Delaware, nearly 50% of the shares, they're much smaller holdings. So yes. So let's see. Oh, this is about the concentration of ownership. So if women are owning shares, which are only, say, 10 and 20 shares, they're not going to be the majority shareholders by far. There's the high concentration of ownership. If you look at the US as a whole, this is a calculation on the top. There are about 6 million bank shares floating around in the US in 1897. And this is breaking it down by different groups, the number of shareholders who are holding each amount, and then trying to look at the percentage. So I couldn't break it down to the top 10%, but the top 10% owners own basically 47% of all shares. And then the top 0.7, well, close enough to 1%, own about 10%. So it's fairly concentrated. And that's pretty much true across the board. It's very dominant. Only in places, some states, it's less, but it's pretty clearly a fairly dominant group. Now, in New York City, the 6,000 women constituted, as I said, 39% of shareholders, and they had only 22% of the total shares outstanding. But there's not a single, as I can find, a single female member of the board of directors or of management. So even though they held shares, I think they were sufficiently diffuse that they were almost like a widows and orphans, I think, to middle class to hold. So here's the picture of New York. Percentage of shares and shareholders up. And then, so that's basically, I think, the picture there. What about employment? Well, they don't provide any aggregate statistics on men, but I don't think that's very limiting in this case, because over here you can see this is the number of women employees. There were 500 women employed in national banks at the time. There were about over 5,000 banks, so this is a very small part of their workforce. We know what their annual wages are, and if you just take the average of that, it's only $500. It's about $500, $600. That means that they're basically in menial jobs for the most part. And if you look at, for instance, in New York, where they're being paid $636 on average, the teller is being paid $800, an assistant cashier $2,500, a cashier would be the chief financial officer $4,500, a president $7,500. So they are limited in that they're limited in jobs quite severely. Now, what's interesting, I think, I mean, their jobs would be to clean up after the end of the day and so forth. Nothing of any is responsibility, except keeping the door locked, perhaps, afterwards. However, that's not true of the government. And this is the head office of the Comptroller of the Currency in Washington, D.C. And its staffing. This is in 1898, to try to get a relatively similar period. It turns out that the Comptroller was opened in 1864, and it's in the middle of the Civil War. There aren't many men you can staff it with. So you find out that there are women clerks to handle all the information. They're called female clerks. It's the lowest pay grade. But what's interesting is over the course of the 19th century afterwards, they begin rising up. And as they rise up, anyone who has the same title gets the same pay, which is different than what we think happens today. And so this is in 1898. And it gives this is the total number of, actually it's men in the fourth column from the left. So there you have the comptroller who received a salary of 5,000, his deputy, his chief clerk, and then the I would say the senior officials, chief of division, bookkeepers, and all these titles seem very lowly, but actually they were quite important. And then you get down to clerk third class, and you find the first woman. So she's just at the lower ends of management there, but having quite a respectable salary of 1,600. Going further down, in second class clerks, there are 7 women, in first class 8, and then in the lower levels even more. So it becomes they've actually made their way up considerably in the government in this case, although there's not a female examiner until later on. So they form an important part of the workforce there. I'll summarize otherwise. So what you see in this case is that there are women in banking. There are a few exceptions. What you see women in management positions, usually on the frontier, where there's a scarcity of human capital, and where if some husband dies, there's no friend or family member, a woman will step into the job of president until a son comes along. So there are exceptions like the brokers or even like Hetty Green, but very few make it in. The interesting thing, I think, is that there's quite a deal of ownership of banks, which should ultimately, in the longer run, give them an opportunity. But I think that the question which I'm struggling with at the moment is, how did they get a hold of the stock in the first place? And it's possible, if you do a little demographic exercise, suppose that men purchased stock at the beginning. No women did. So some men are going to die before they have any children. The women will inherit the stock, or they may have all female children. So eventually you're going to diffuse that. And it turns out it's going to come pretty close, a little bit lower than this level here. So it's going to diffuse this way without a lot of purchases. So many barriers. So this gets us to the final question. I think that's where missing the slide. How do we talk about women bankers in the 19th century? What kind of gendered pronoun did we use? Because there are very few, and they're a very hard time. And I think the answer to that has to be, perhaps if you're talking about the comptroller of the currency, you might want to use he or she, because that characterizes over the periods women are rising. But in terms of banking management, I think for me, I would probably want to use put a large footnote at the end and at the beginning and explain, use he for as long as there are virtually no women, that there are exceptions, in order to make clear that there's an extensive misogyny in the period. But this is one of these delicate things that I think a historian has to struggle with, as to how to appropriately describe. So any suggestions would be helpful. I've had people write to me and say, gee, I have some more data, and more data is what we need. Because this is a historical exercise. I think of it like you've discovered a giant Roman mosaic and you're trying to figure out what the missing pieces are in there to try to get the whole picture. And really, that's what we're trying to do here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this broad information, big research schedule you are working on. So let's look around and see if there are any questions concerning your research.
Any chance to take a look at any of the trust?
So there, to see if women are certainly there are women who have trust accounts. So the problem here is really, I think, how and why did they collect data? And in a trust company, you might have had very few clients. You could have had 50 clients. You know everyone very well. You don't have to establish them. Here, there are thousands of people coming into the bank. They called it dividend day, but they made their payments on their savings accounts and fixed times of the year, and they'd have huge lines coming in. Some people treated this almost as like a bond, like they'd invest in for their retirement, and they'd come in. So they had to have some way of figuring out who all these people were, and they would use the test book. That's why there's this, it's a singular document in this, and it's probably, commercial banks are much clubbier. Trust companies are much clubbier, and this is where we see them. They're probably, and so as far as women being excluded from business, they would be less likely to go to a commercial bank. And when commercial banks start having women depositors, they often set aside a special room and a special teller, so they won't have to mingle with all the men and possibly be subject to scandalous comments and rumors. So,
questions in the room? You should use the microphone, I was told.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm coming from a perspective of a hobby of mine. I like to read political novels, and they are starting in the beginning of the 18th century. So one of the subjects in these political novels were female politicians in times when they were not able to vote. So I read a little bit about the history of their ownership, and as far as I know, what you talked at the beginning, and on what condition women could have their own money, that women with money in England were very strict, limited. They had only a few opportunities, if ever, even if they were wealthy enough to hire good legal advice. My impression was that in the States it was different. What you mentioned, that there came a time when they had more and more opportunities. So I think when you ask the question, where do get their money from, or how could they hold money? My impression was on secondary information that at that time, women with money could, using foundation, for example, when they had a high number of foundation, which you assumed as constitutional shareholders, perhaps women were hiding behind that also.
in terms of, yes, charities.
Charities,
You may
yeah.
have found, yes.
Yeah, so
There is, and I said, there is one woman. So the Immigrant Savings Bank primarily invests in mortgages, and and you can see it. They're fairly broad-minded in lending out money. And it's primarily a Catholic institution, but they do very well. But when they have excess funds, they want to sink into a mortgage. They do what every other bank does. That is, they go to the broker's loan market. They offer loans to brokers. And in the list of brokers, there's one woman who's a stockbroker, not the Claflin and sisters, but there's a broker there. So there's some brokerage activity among women, and it's not just to deal with female customers or women customers. It's to they're entrepreneurs on their own right, but a very, very small minority.
So what I would like to suggest that you do the same approach as I did. So read novels about economic, and perhaps you'll find some stories where they invent or describe how women were able to deal in money, as I figured out that they were dealing in politics. And my assumption is that there might be some other way of lending money, and perhaps in this regard, women were also active. For example, when you look at the history back, your first speech here about goldsmiths, and they started as bankers, perhaps in the jewel industry or other areas, women were also active because they choose the ways they were able to take. Thank you.
So there was there's all kinds of social constraints on one's ability to do this. And one was, if you're going to work, where are you going to have lunch? And or what they would have called dinner, there were very constraints. It was not regarded as a good thing in the 1850s for women to be seen in a restaurant because they assumed that she had another occupation other than banker. And so this is only really in the late 19th century you begin to see restaurants which cater especially to women and giving an opportunity for women who are just going shopping to have a place to be. But it's very difficult in many ways. They would have been harassed on the street to a considerable degree.
Thank you for this very interesting project. I'm also interested in the it is possible to look at the impact of having women in banking in the 19th century. For example, were the women, like the female presidents or the employees, gender conscious, that they, for example, would like to involve more female employees in the bank, or they would like to do more business with female business owners and so on?
Well, that's a good question. I think you'd have to look at memoirs almost to be able to see what their views were, because there's so few in number. What something that came to mind, but it's just such small numbers. It's hard to see that they're trying to encourage. Oh, I was going to say. So when I was in 1990, I wrote a semi-official history of the comptroller of the currency from the period 1960 to 1990. So we're jumping 50 years ahead. And one of the people I talked to was the first woman who reached the role of deputy deputy comptroller. They have 6 deputy comptrollers. And it's interesting because she never complained about anything, but you could see that it was a struggle oftentimes going to bankers trying to impress that she's the tough government official. And there's also some cultural issues as well. She was explained that she talked about the 1980s when she had to go down to Texas where there's a huge banking crisis, banks failing left and right. What happened is they'd invested too much in oil and oil drilling, and the oil prices had collapsed. And they had a Saturday meeting where they're trying to talk to them about how they can stabilize the banking situation. And most of the guys have been out drinking that night. They're going down in the elevator after she's giving a talk. And the guy looks at her and says, "Ma'am, you sure do like those tables and charts, you know?" So there's a big cultural divide in that way, but also speaks to the fact that she's educated in a way in a very modern way, as opposed to those bankers who are really just personal and character loans as possible.
Additional questions from our colleagues in
Okay.
Question: when and why did American banks started ladies' departments?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that one, but I suspect that's in the very late 19th century. Certainly in the 1920s, they're very active. Women in the stock market boom of the 1920s, there's a famous article written by one of the biggest investors. It's called "Everyone Should Be Rich," and it's published in Ladies' Home Journal, the biggest magazine. And so there are lots of brokerages open up ladies' departments where they can go and look at the ticker tape and not be molested by the men around. So I think that's more a 20th century development. I was trying to look mostly at the 19th century, but I think that certainly by that period. Also, you have development of women's colleges and growth of that. So you have a lot more educated, more human capital, more educated population of women, and that means that you're going to get they end up being wealthier, more opportunities that way too. So I think that's really 20th century development.
Thank you very much. A question from abroad is, in companies where women were shareholders, did the investment pattern change over time? It's a question about the impact of ladies investors.
That's a good question, but you need a lot more information. You need to know how the firm was behaving. And I think most of them, what's important, at least in the banks, is having a share on the board of directors. If you're not on the board of directors, you're not going to have much guidance for the company. And that's, at least for New York, I can look at the boards of directors to see. Now, one reason for looking at some of this very aggregate data, and I'll go back to say, well, where would I look if I was interested in that question? And somewhere here, yeah. Where I would probably go would be San Francisco, to look at the banks in San Francisco, because that's where women hold a very large share of the stock, and where we probably find that they're important. So go back even to the national banking records and then go to the archives, because you want to see where women are directors. And that's San Francisco is probably this the town of loose morals on the far edge of the continent is where you're going to find them having the most influence. But you have to find areas where it's likely to see them as directors, and I suspect that's the one place. So that's that. When the archives opens up after COVID, it would be a great place to do it.
Thank you again. Other question questions in the room you should ask as well. I think you have some. So I'm going to read the next. This is a question about the term "the witch" or the witch of Wall Street. Who coined it? Do you know that? And do you know if it really Mrs. Green commented on this? That
she would have had no patience for that. On her 70th birthday, they recorded in the newspaper a visit. She came to her office. By that time, she had this wonderful office, a brand new skyscraper. And from reading the description, she probably had half a floor, huge amount of space, and at least several offices. And she came in, there's a crowd of reporters, and one of them asks her the following questions: do you eat onions in order to live to age 80? Isn't that what you would have asked J.P. Morgan? Well, it turns out that it was a common folk remedy to have an onion to keep away colds, but she didn't answer it. She just slammed the door. So a lot of this is sort of baiting. Well, the press would never bait anyone today, would they? So there's a lot of that going on. So I don't think she was very happy with all that, but she was very much, one thing one has to understand is that she was very much a Quaker, and Quakers were very quiet people. They would not respond to challenges. They were pacifists, and they lived modestly. And when she died, she gave a lot of her money away to charities and to her children. And when they died, it ensured that the fortune was spread out to charities. So it's a very modest lifestyle, and probably one she was so wealthy, but she didn't fit in with the elite. She, didn't want her daughter to have a fancy wedding dress. She believed in being plain being a virtue. And I think that probably stuck with the upper classes women not very well, that she was violating many things, making more money than their husbands and dressing like a witch, as far as they were concerned.
Really an interesting personality, of course. Now we have a question from South Africa. It's Gretchen Verhoff. She wants to know if you are able to tell us if women were investing in South Africa's mineral discoveries.
Ooh, that's a tough question. You have to look at you have to look at a company which is involved. And I don't know about African, but the Guggenheims were very active in mining, particularly in Mexico and Latin America. And I think it's pretty much a male-dominated family again. I was reading, there's a very good book actually on the women in the Rothschild family. And it's entirely from their point of view. And you find that some of them were actually they sort of those who were energetic split their activities. Some of them actually had sufficient money. They invested on their own and made quite well. Others invested in politics because you needed to have a political side to the operation. So, and I think that can't be ignored too much, because well, first of all, for minorities like Jews, it was very important to try and break into the society. That would even be true in the US, but also it was a partnership in a way in working on the political side, because in any big financial deal, whether it's steel, railroads in particular, you need to have the politicians on your side, and that would be regarded as maybe the women's sphere to organize that. But it's very hard to see exactly how they're involved in investments. That's maybe internal family decisions, which are very difficult to pick out.
Thank you. The next question is about the role of women in banking history. Can you tell us about female researcher?
Oh, yes. So if anything, well, Anna Schwartz, who passed away a few years ago, is one of the great economic monetary historians of all time, and certainly of the 20th century. And she would have said, when we stand on the shoulders of giants, and she would have pointed to an earlier generation of women, not as well known, who wrote books on the New York. I'm thinking there's a book called the New York Financial Market, and I can't remember her. Margaret Mead. Yep. And so there's that, and that's in the 20s or 30s, so quite a while back. And today there's a lot of good scholars. This paper was sitting in my drawer, and then one of my friends, Angela Radish, at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, was retiring. I said, okay, this has to come out. I have the data. I should do a presentation on this for her. But there are others who've worked on, my colleague at Rutgers, Gail Trina, does Latin America, and has done a great deal on banking in Latin America and finance. And so there are a lot of young women scholars, and a growing number. If you look at if you want to quickly review how women have finally gained a strong foothold in financial history, look at the membership of the National Bureau of Economic Research. If you look at the development of the American economy, you'll see, if you can figure out who's old and young, you'll see there's a great influx of young women doing wonderful work.
Hey, thank you. A follow-up question to this point, maybe the second question of Friederike. She wants to know if you could conclude your talk by showing us what will be the difference of American women today is different with women in the 19th century.
Well,
as women in the banking sector, or women as shareholders?
I think as always, it's always if you're a minority, it's always harder. You have to, whatever defeat you have to purge forward. a good thing to do would be, if especially with regard to the question about women in financial history, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which has a website, nber.org, has videos. It has one or two of Anna Schwartz, but there's one of Claudia Golden, who is the first woman who to become a full tenured professor in the economics department, who's giving this talk about her. And she makes clear, and as the Anna's daughters make clear, that nothing would deter her. The fact they wouldn't give her a PhD at Columbia because she had a co-authored book. Today, of course, that's nothing. So I think, so remind the question again. I got a little drifted off of.
You could show us the differences between.
Yes. And so one has to be, I think, a little bit tougher, maybe. I don't know. But all I can say is that if you look at Janet Yellen, who's been head of the Fed and now head of the Treasury, that's pretty much at the very top there. And that's the important thing to attract, whether it's women, African Americans, or other, is to have enough people visible that they see, oh, that person's like me, and it's an encouragement. And we find that as a very important issue. So I think the pathway is very good now because you have a lot of women in very prominent positions in both academia and in the government.
Right. So I'm having a look around. Corona. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your impressive data collection. So, of course, this question, which was already popped up a little bit, how the divestment behavior of women in general is different from that of men. And of course, it's a tricky question because to find data about it, and I don't know if it would be possible to look it from the individual person and to see in which firms
So I can answer that for the late 20th and early 21st century because there are household survey studies.
Yes.
The late 20th century finds that men are bigger risk takers than women. Looking at cryptocurrencies, it's found out that the primary owners tend to be more male, white, less educated, et cetera, et cetera. So women are, shall we say, probably more conservative or long-term investors in that case. And why that's the case is harder to say, but that appears to be consistent whether you're looking at traditional investments or even cryptocurrencies.
And do you think one would be able to do that research in historical terms to check it for the end of the 19th century?
So the only way you could do that is to look at probates and to see what investments people have when they died and when they've not been, then they have to go through the courts. That's a filter which is awkward, but you can find out a great deal. And one time when I was working on who bought French debt after the Napoleonic invasions and figuring out how they had the English, one of my friends, Peter Linder, said, well, I'll give you a good investor, David Ricardo. The economist. And what was interesting to see is that his portfolio was very small. He only had 3 or 4 securities in it because that was the market. And so what you're going to find the further back you go is that there's a very limited group. In talking about novels, if you look at Jane Austen, what do they talk about? Consols. You know, how many government bonds? That's all they really care about until the mid 19th century, when you get a broader array of investments in railroads and banks. And I suppose that would be the crucial period, seeing when there's a new opportunity, do more women come in? And you could look at the subscription lists. If you can get subscription lists to like the initial public offerings, you may be able to see the names there. And that's a possible thing to do.
And my second question would be about networks of these women. And perhaps that's again research one could do more in a qualitative manner to check where they came from, what was the educational background, and were they active in politics in any way. So for Mrs. Green, it's probably not the case. You said she was very quiet. So, but you could imagine also women active in suffrage or women right movement or something like that.
Well, you know, searching the web is a kind of interesting exercise. We don't know what kind of filter you're actually getting. And I found another interesting woman. This is McKinley's wife. And she actually, her father was a banker. And what's problematic is when you look on the road, either she was the cashier in the bank or she was his assistant. A huge difference between the two. But she obviously was familiar enough with banking to carry on. But it's because usually the first time you may not get an official position, but you learn, like at Green, being trained. There's no training in accounting. There's no training in finance in the 19th century. You have to learn it typically through a family network. And so that's the hard part, in that many of the family networks just excluded women entirely, unless there's only one daughter. So that's the only one child is a daughter.
Question from my side. You are a financial historian, so can you explain why it was so attractive for women to invest in banks? If you think about all these awful financial crises in America, why didn't they invest in banks?
So if I look at their investments in national banks, I would say they're a very sound investment. In the late 19th century, there's very few U.S. government bonds. The U.S. government debt's declining. Most of those bonds are owned by banks themselves, who have to use it as security against their currency. So what do you buy? You can buy railroads, which are volatile over the business cycle, but banks are pretty stable. They pay fairly stable dividends. In the New York banks, which I've looked at, this is a period from 1887 up to 1909, so it covers several major panics. No depositor lost 1 cent the whole time. You would have often, sometimes directors would have to make good, other shareholders would have to put in, but it was a pretty safe investment. And if you looked at the dividends, they're being paid out. So it's strange. We may have crises, but in the long run, if you bought a couple of bank shares, especially the larger ones, I wouldn't recommend buying a new bank which is starting up in 1907. That would be a risky thing to do, because that's the boom. But if you have one which has been operating for quite some time, that would be good. But again, if you knew a banker and talked to it, you could find out which of the banks one might prefer over time. But that's really one of the safest investments. And by 1900, if you guys said what are conservative investments, they would be big banks and big railroads, not industrials.
So they were really rational investors, the women.
Yes.
Okay. Any questions left? I think it's not the case. So it's my turn to say thank you very much. It was really insightful and we learned a lot. And
Well, I'm happy after 30 years to be able to pull the file out of my filing cabinet, actually fill it with some data. And to answer, it's always good to answer questions which have long been bothering him. So this seems to open the door.
You have to talk about it so others can participate in this research field. Thank you very much. And we hope you will have a nice stay here in Frankfurt the last 2 weeks. I think you are still here. So if anybody is interested to have some.
Yes, please, if you're interested, I'm happy to tell me about your research projects and where you might look. And I think so like the subscription lists for stocks would be very interesting, because that's where you would be most likely to find female investors.
Okay, thank you.